They told me they were tapped out, stretched thin, living on a pension and whatever my father made doing odd jobs since he'd taken early retirement. That was 4 years ago, when my daughter was 6 years old and the doctors had just told us her heart was failing. I believed them. God help me, I believed every word. My daughter's name is Rosie. She came into the world 7 weeks early, tiny enough that my husband could hold her entire body in one hand, and she fought from her very first breath. She had her father's dark eyes and this ridiculous laugh that sounded like a small goose, and she loved strawberries and hated socks, and fell asleep every night with one arm wrapped around a stuffed elephant she'd named Trumpet. She was the best thing I had ever done with my life. She was the only thing I was certain about. When she was 5, she started getting tired in a way that little kids just don't get tired. She'd climb 3 steps and stop to breathe. She'd fall asleep at the dinner table, face practically in her pasta. Her pediatrician thought it was anemia at first, then a respiratory thing, then something else. It took 8 months and 4 specialists before a cardiologist at BC Children's Hospital in Vancouver sat across from my husband and me and explained that Rosie had a condition called dilated cardiomyopathy. Her heart was enlarged. It wasn't pumping blood the way it should. Without intervention, he said carefully, children with her presentation typically did not do well. He was being kind. What he meant was that she could die. The treatment plan was aggressive. Medication first, to stabilize her. Then we'd see. But the more likely path, he told us, was that she would eventually need a heart transplant. And to get onto the transplant list at BC Children's, we needed to be registered, assessed, and ready, which meant a workup that insurance covered partially but not entirely. The gap was somewhere around $28,000. $28,000 for assessments, specialist travel, the coordinating fees that provincial health coverage didn't touch because some of it crossed into out-of-province specialist territory. I want to be clear about something. We are not poor. My husband works in commercial construction management. I was working part-time as a dental hygienist while Rosie was in school. We owned a small townhouse in Coquitlam. We had RRSPs. But $28,000, on top of the time I'd already had to reduce my hours to take Rosie to appointments, on top of the mortgage and the cost of just living, it was not something we could pull from the air. So I called my parents. My mother answered on the second ring. I told her everything. Rosie's diagnosis, the treatment pathway, the gap in coverage. I had written it all down beforehand because I knew I would cry if I tried to explain it unprepared. And I didn't want to cry. I wanted to be clear. I wanted to be practical. I told her the number. I told her what it was for. She said she needed to talk to my father. She'd call me back. She called back 2 hours later. My father was on the line too, which they only did for serious conversations. They were so sorry, they said. They wished they could help. But things were tight. My father's back had been acting up, and he'd had some work dry up. Their savings were for emergencies. I was their daughter, and they loved me, and they loved Rosie, but they just couldn't do it right now. Maybe in a few months things would be better, and they could help a little. I thanked them. I hung up. My husband held me while I cried in our kitchen, and then we figured out what to do next. We set up a GoFundMe. I hated doing it. I'm a private person. I was raised to think that you handle your problems yourself and you don't ask strangers for help. But Rosie needed to get on that list and we needed the money, and pride is a luxury you lose very quickly when your child's heart is failing. Friends shared it, colleagues shared it. My husband's coworkers put together a collection at the site. A woman I'd never met who lived in Kelowna donated $500 and left a message that just said, "For Rosie." We raised just over $22,000 in 6 weeks. The remaining $6,000 we covered with a line of credit. Rosie got her assessment. She got on the list. And then we waited. I don't know how to explain waiting when you are waiting for someone else's child to die so that your child can live. It is the most complicated grief I have ever sat with. You find yourself doing mental math that makes you feel like a monster. You check your phone every time it rings, and your stomach drops, and then you feel guilty for hoping. Rosie's cardiologist called it one of the hardest experiences a family can go through. And that was the most accurate thing anyone said to us during that entire period. We waited for 11 months. In that time, Rosie deteriorated twice. Once badly enough that we spent 9 days at BC Children's while they adjusted her medications and monitored her heart function around the clock. My husband slept on a fold-out chair. I slept on the room's little couch. We took turns going home to shower. Rosie watched every episode of a cartoon about a dog who was also a chef and told anyone who came in the room that she was going to be a chef when she grew up and make strawberry cake every day. She never got her transplant. In the 10th month, Rosie had a cardiac event in the middle of the night. I was asleep beside her in her bed because I'd taken to doing that. I couldn't sleep in my own room anymore. I needed to hear her breathing. I woke up because something changed in the sound of her, some shift I felt before I understood it, and I turned on the light and I knew before I even called 911. I knew. She was 7 years and 4 months old. The weeks after are blurry in the way that grief makes things blurry. People came. Food appeared on our porch. My husband took emergency leave from work. I sat in Rosie's room for long stretches of time and held trumpet and did not speak. My mother came out from Winnipeg and stayed for 2 weeks, and she cried a great deal and said all the things people say. And I let her hug me and I said nothing about the $28,000. My father came for the service and flew home the same evening. My parents went back to Winnipeg. My brother, who lived there too, sent a card. He and I had never been close. He was 5 years older than me and we'd occupied different worlds since we were teenagers. But the card felt like the bare minimum a person could do, and I noted it and moved on. My husband and I rebuilt ourselves the way people do, slowly, without grace, making mistakes. We went back to work. We saw a grief counselor, a woman who worked out of a little office near Commercial Drive in Vancouver and who had a way of sitting with silence that I found more useful than anything she actually said. We kept Rosie's room the way it was for almost a year. Then, together, we made it into something different, not erasing her, reorganizing around her absence. 2 years passed. In the 3rd year, I started volunteering with a pediatric cardiac support organization, a nonprofit that helps families navigate exactly the kind of gaps we'd fallen into, the coverage issues, the financial shortfalls, the parts of the system that no one tells you about until you're in the middle of them. It became, over time, the thing that gave my grief somewhere to go. I trained as a peer support worker. I took calls from parents who were exactly where I had been, and I told them the things I wished someone had told me. My parents and I existed in a kind of careful détente. We spoke on the phone. We visited at Christmas. I didn't bring up Rosie unless they did, and they usually didn't. I had made a private decision that there was no version of that conversation I could have with them that would give me anything I needed, so I didn't have it. I carried it, and I went on. Then, 14 months ago, my brother called me. He and I spoke rarely enough that a call from him made my stomach tighten before I even picked up. He asked how I was. I said fine. He asked about the volunteer work. I said it was going well. And then he said, I wanted to tell you myself before you heard it from Mum. They helped me buy a house. I sat down. He'd been renting in St. Boniface for years, he explained, and the market had moved, and our parents had offered to contribute to a down payment. They'd given him $60,000. He said it matter-of-factly, as if the number were unremarkable, and I remember thinking that he genuinely might not have known what he was telling me. He might not have connected it. He said he thought I should know. I said thank you for telling me. I got off the phone. I went into the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub and stared at the tiles for a long time. $60,000. They had given my brother $60,000 for a down payment on a house in the same year they told me they were tapped out and couldn't help me keep my daughter alive. In the same year, I went back through my memory of that phone call, the one where my father had said his back was acting up, where my mother had said their savings were for emergencies, and I understood now what an emergency actually meant to them, not a 7-year-old's failing heart, a house. A down payment for the son who had never asked for anything difficult. I did not call my parents that night. I did not call them the next night either. I called my grief counselor, and I sat on the phone with her for an hour and cried in a way I hadn't cried since the first year after Rosie died. Because it was different grief. It wasn't new grief. It was old grief with a new, horrible shape to it. The realization that it hadn't needed to be this hard, that there had been money, that the money had existed and had simply been designated for someone else. My husband was furious in the clean, uncomplicated way that I envied. He thought I should confront them directly. He thought I should say everything I was thinking. I wasn't sure I had it in me to survive that conversation, but I also knew I couldn't go on pretending. So I called my mother. I told her I knew about the down payment. I told her the number my brother had given me. I told her that 4 years ago, when I had called and asked for help to get Rosie onto a transplant list, that money had existed and they had said no, and I needed her to explain that to me. There was a long silence. She said it was complicated. She said that at the time, they weren't sure how their finances would look in the future, and they had wanted to hold the money back. She said my father had felt that the medical system should be handling it. She said that what they'd given my brother was different, that it was something they planned for both of us, and that they'd been waiting for the right time to help me too. But then Rosie died, and it seemed wrong to bring up money. She said a lot of things. I listened to all of them. Then I said, Rosie is dead. You had $60,000. I needed $28,000. I told her I was not calling to punish her. I was calling because I had spent 3 years being careful with them, protecting them from the weight of this, and I was done doing that. I told her that I needed her to understand what I understood now, not so she would feel worse, but because I could not continue a relationship built on me pretending I didn't know what I knew. My mother cried. She said she was sorry. She said my father was sorry. She said they had been in therapy. They'd been seeing a counselor together since Rosie died, which I had not known. She said they would do anything. I told her I didn't know what I needed yet. I told her I would be in touch. I hung up and I sat with it. For weeks, I sat with it. My husband and I talked about it at length, late at night. The kind of conversations that go in circles and then find a thread. My grief counselor and I went over it many times. I talked to one woman in my peer support network who had had a similar rupture with her own family and had rebuilt it, and another woman who had chosen not to and seemed at peace with that too. There was no consensus. There was no consensus. Then my father called me. He doesn't call me. That is almost entirely my mother's territory, so when his number came up, I felt the shift of it immediately. He asked if I had a minute. I said yes. He said very little preamble. He said, I don't have excuses. I have reasons, but I know they're not enough. We chose wrong. We chose wrong, and your daughter paid for it, and I have to live with that. That was all he said on the subject. Then he asked about the volunteer work, and I told him about it, and we talked for 20 minutes about something almost ordinary, and then we said goodbye. I thought about that call for a long time. My parents flew out to Vancouver 4 months ago. We met for dinner, my husband and me, my parents, at a quiet restaurant near Main Street, not somewhere any of us had history, neutral ground. It was awkward. There were silences that nobody rushed to fill. My mother looked older than I'd remembered. My father ordered the same thing twice by accident and didn't notice, and my mother corrected him quietly, and I saw in that small exchange that they were genuinely diminished by this. Not absolved, but diminished. I did not forgive them that night. I want to be honest about that. I did not feel a wave of peace or release or any of the things people describe when they talk about forgiveness like it's an event. What I felt was more like an opening of a window that had been painted shut. Not a resolution, a possibility. What they told me over the course of that dinner was that they had sold my father's income property, a small rental unit in Winnipeg they'd been holding since the 90s, and donated the proceeds to BC Children's Hospital's cardiac fund, about $90,000. They hadn't told me beforehand because they hadn't wanted it to feel like a transaction, like buying back my goodwill. They'd done it, they said, because it was the only direction they could think to send the guilt that was otherwise just going to sit inside them and rot. I looked at my husband across the table. He reached over and put his hand on mine. I thought about Rosie. I thought about Trumpet, the stuffed elephant, which was currently sitting on the small shelf above the desk in our spare room, which had been Rosie's room and was now something in between. I thought about what she would have thought of this dinner, and I almost smiled, because she would have been deeply uninterested in any of it and would have spent the whole meal trying to get someone to let her taste their dessert. I thought about the other parents who were in right now where I'd been. The ones calling the GoFundMe link at 1 a.m, the ones sleeping on fold-out chairs. I thought about who I wanted to be. I told my parents that I couldn't go back, that no amount of money redirected and no conversations had in therapists' offices would give us back what was lost. I told them I didn't think they were monsters. I had to really work to get to that conclusion, and I got there slowly, but I got there. I told them that I was going to need them to be patient with me, that some visits would be harder than others, that there would be days when I picked up the phone to call and couldn't do it, and I needed them to understand that that was me trying, not me withdrawing. My mother nodded. My father stared at the tablecloth. I told them that the door was not closed, that I was choosing to leave it open, not because what they did was acceptable, and not because it didn't cost us everything. It did, and it always will. But because Rosie loved her grandparents, and because the person I've been building since I lost her is someone who tries to move forward even when forward is incomprehensible. We said goodnight in the parking lot. My mother hugged me for a long time and didn't say anything. My father shook my husband's hand and then looked at me and said, "Thank you for coming." On the drive home, my husband and I didn't talk much. Vancouver was quiet for a Tuesday, and the bridges were lit up over the water, and I watched the lights and felt the complicated weight of the evening settling into something I didn't yet have a name for. That was 4 months ago. We talk every week now, my parents and I. Short calls usually. The territory is different, more careful, more deliberate, less assumption on anyone's part that we know what the other needs. I still have days when I get off the phone and sit quietly for a few minutes and let the sadness move through me. I still have days when the anger comes back sharp and fresh, and I have to choose, again, what I'm going to do with it. But I think about what Rosie's cardiologist told us during the worst stretch of her illness. He said that families in crisis either break against it or they find, somehow, what they are actually made of. He was talking about my marriage. He could have been talking about anything. Some mornings I drive to work and the sun comes up over the mountains east of the city and I think about her. I think about the strawberries she ate with 2 hands, juice running down her wrists. I think about Trumpet. I think about that laugh, the small goose laugh, which I can still hear if I am quiet enough. I don't know what the right ending to this story is. I'm not sure it has one yet. What I know is that I am still here, still moving, still trying to be the person she thought I was, the person she'd lean against on the couch and fall asleep on and trust completely without ever thinking about it, because that is what children do before the world teaches them not to. I am trying every day to deserve that. There's a moment in this story I keep coming back to. Not the phone call where I found out about the $60,000, not even the night I lost Rosie. It's the smaller moment, earlier than all of that, when I sat at the kitchen table and wrote down the number $28,000 on a piece of paper so I wouldn't cry while I was asking for it. I was preparing to be calm. I was preparing to make it easy for them to say yes. I think about that version of me often, the one who was so careful not to make anyone uncomfortable while her daughter was dying. What I've come to understand, slowly, and not without a lot of sitting in the dark with it, is that the consequences in this story weren't delivered by anything dramatic. There was no single moment of reckoning. What happened instead was quieter and more permanent. My parents made a choice, and that choice became the thing they will carry for the rest of their lives. The $90,000 donated to BC Children's Cardiac Fund doesn't undo it. The therapy doesn't undo it. Nothing undoes it. And I think they know that, which is why my father's voice sounded the way it did on the phone when he said, "We chose wrong." He wasn't asking for absolution. He was just finally telling the truth. That's something I've thought a lot about. The difference between honesty that comes too late and dishonesty that compounds over time. My parents weren't cruel people. I don't believe that. But they lacked the clarity to look at a situation and name it accurately, to say, this is a child's life, and this is a house, and those two things are not equal. That kind of clarity, the ability to think carefully and honestly even when it costs you something, that's what was missing. And its absence cost all of us more than I can put into words. I think about Rosie when I think about what I want to pass forward, not in a ceremonial way, just in the ordinary way of living. She was 7 years old and she had more courage in a single afternoon at BC Children's than most adults I know manage in a year. She was afraid, and she was also completely, entirely herself, demanding strawberries, naming her elephant, wanting to know when she could go home and make strawberry cake. That is its own kind of wisdom, the kind that doesn't come from reading or experience, but from somewhere deeper, some refusal to be anything other than who you are. I am trying to be that. It takes more effort as an adult, I think. You have to choose it deliberately every day, to act with honesty even when it's inconvenient, to keep going even when the going makes no logical sense, to stay decent when decency is the harder option. I chose to leave the door open with my parents not because I'm naturally forgiving or because the wound closed. It's still open. But I decided that the person Rosie knew, the one she slept against on the couch without thinking twice, would not let grief make her smaller than she already was. That is the only inheritance I have left to give her.